Moving on, finally, scenario 2, arousal. In terms of arousal in scenario 2, firstly, we can see some somatic and cognitive features of arousal and the symptoms for these present within this scenario, as well as scenario 1. For example, we can see cognitive arousal features similarly to cognitive anxiety features within scenario 2, as these share the same symptoms. These consist of internal thoughts like worry, apprehension, inability to concentrate, and negative thoughts. We can see these cognitive features of anxiety and arousal are clearly present in Sarah in these more important games, as she struggles to make decisions in these games, as well as showing heightened anxiety and arousal, causing negative thoughts and overall decreasing her performance, specifically in these games. These are all cognitive anxiety and arousal features that contribute towards Sarah's poor performance in these games. On the other hand, although the scenario is not clear whether Sarah does experience somatic arousal and anxiety features, it is likely that this does occur as her performance shows high levels of arousal due to her decrease in performance in these games, in comparison to less competitive games. It is likely that somatic features such as increased heart rate, sweaty palms, or maybe even feeling sick could be present, as well as cognitive features earlier mentioned in these important games, as we know her levels of arousal in general increase during these games, meaning it is likely both somatic and cognitive features of anxiety and arousal are present within Sarah in scenario 2. It has been argued that levels of arousal can affect a person's attention field and concentration levels. One example of this would be Naidfair in 1976 determined that increased arousal levels could cause changes in attention and concentration. High levels of arousal can occur when athletes have too much information to attend to at one time. This means in terms of overall arousal, when arousal is too high, this can cause a person's attention field to become too narrow, as you can see here in the image above, which would mean that performance would not be as good as possible, as this would mean the performer would be disregarding other important factors in the game, as they are only paying attention to a small amount of things in comparison to the many they will need to consider in order to perform maximally. Therefore, this over-arousal would have a negative effect on performance, as this would cause the narrowing of the athlete's attention field, which would mean that they are less able to take in all the external factors they would need to in order to maximally perform. As well as this narrow attention field could further lead to causing the athlete to attend to the wrong cue, and also causing the player to scan the field less often to be aware of what's happening in the whole game. All of these reasons explain why over-arousal can cause a person's performance to decrease, as this could cause a narrowing of their attention field. This, in terms of Sarah in scenario 2, could be present, as we know she has high levels of arousal when taking part in these crunch games, and therefore may have a narrow attention field, which alongside stress, anxiety and arousal levels could be a contributing factor towards why her performance may be decreasing in these more important games. In addition, it's clear that Sarah plays well in the games that are less important, and she is less aroused. This could mean for these specific games she could be working within the correct levels of arousal, meaning that her attention field would be the optimum attention field as shown in the image above here, where she can take in all the external information she needs to, as well as focusing on the correct amount of her performance in order to play well. As we do see good performance from Sarah in these less important games. Moreover, in terms of Nick in scenario 1, we are also aware that Nick has high levels of arousal in game as well as poor performance. This narrow attention field could also be present within his performance, and could also be a contributing factor to his recent decrease in performance, as well as other factors earlier mentioned. So as you can see, these are the three different attention fields which can be caused from optimal levels to low arousal and to high arousal. Moving on then to arousal theory, inverted U theory. Another theory in terms of arousal that was briefly mentioned earlier is known as the inverted U theory. This particular theory believes that as arousal gradually increases, so does performance up until an optimal point. This optimal point can be found at the peak of the graph, which it is here, and is the point in which performance is maximal and cannot increase from that point onwards. However, if arousal continues to increase even after this optimal point has been reached, then this will cause a gentle and gradual decrease in performance, going from this optimal point to the bottom of the graph, as we can see above. This gradual increase and then decrease throughout once the optimal point has been reached is what causes the shape of this graph above, and is the reason for this particular theory being known as the inverted U shape, as the graph above clearly shows this theory takes the shape of an inverted U, as we can see here. Therefore, this theory differs from catastrophe theory mentioned previously, as this theory believes as well as a gradual increase in performance with arousal, performance will also gradually decrease when arousal becomes too high, as opposed to the dramatic decrease we see in this opposing catastrophe theory. As the graph above on the right shows, different people and different tasks may cause different optimal levels of arousal specific to that person. The red line on this particular graph shows high levels of arousal must be present in order to reach optimal levels in comparison to the blue line, as we can see here as the red line reaches higher on the graph than the blue. The red line represents more elite athletes, and therefore this helps us to determine that it is more likely for more elite athletes to require high levels of arousal in a quicker time in order to reach their optimum levels, as the red line shows here, as they have a more rapid increase to a higher level. Whereas the blue line represents less elite athletes, and this therefore helps us to determine that it is likely that these particular performers will require lower levels of arousal in order to reach their optimal levels. As we can see, the blue line does not peak as high as the red one does. Therefore, in terms of Sarah in scenario 2, we can see that this particular theory may be able to be applied to her and the relation between her performance and levels of arousal. This is because we know that Sarah in these more important and higher pressure games has heightened levels of arousal in comparison to these of less importance. Therefore, in these particular games, her arousal is most likely beyond the optimal levels and therefore will be increasing. Therefore will still be increasing, which, as we can see on the graph above, would cause a gradual decrease in performance. This theory therefore can apply to Sarah, as we know that she sees a decrease in performance in these games, meaning that in these less important games it is likely her levels of arousal are nearer, if not at the optimal level, which is why she is performing well in these games. However, when she takes part in these crunch games, her arousal levels become too high, and therefore cause her performance in relation to the graph and this theory to go beyond optimal, and therefore slowly decrease gradually, as believed by this theory. Overall, this shows how the inverted U theory can be applied to Sarah's performance in these important games, as her levels of arousal are clearly beyond the optimal, and this contributes to causing this decrease in performance she has seen. On the other hand, some criticisms of this particular theory include: does optimal arousal always occur at the midpoint of the curve? This means that different people may have different optimal levels, as the eyes-off theory earlier mentioned suggests, and therefore this optimal level may not occur for everyone at the middle point of the graph like shown above. In addition, another criticism of inverted U theory is decline in performance always gradual. This means we can clearly see in performers sometimes that decrease in performance beyond optimal levels does not occur in a slow gradual way and can happen a lot quicker, which as we can see clearly opposes the graph above, which shows a slow gentle curve down where performance decreases. Moving on, finally, arousal theory, drive theory. The final theory I'm going to discuss in terms of arousal is known as drive theory. This was determined in 1951 by Hull, as is one of the earliest and most simplistic explanations of arousal. This particular theory proposes a linear relationship between arousal and performance, where performance will always increase with arousal, as the graph above shows us. This theory therefore believes that as a person's level of arousal increases, so does their performance. This is clear in the graph above, as we can see a consistent straight line increasing without any sign of decrease or fall in performance with arousal. This helps to show how this theory believes that performance and arousal are directly related, and how as arousal increases, so does performance. Furthermore, Zajoink in 1965 further developed Hull's original drive theory by determining that the presence of others increases arousal, which brings out the dominant response, which is the most likely way a performer is to perform a skill or task. This would mean a performer would respond to a situation with their dominant response when arousal has been increased. For example, in terms of this development on the theory, if a footballer's coach had been attempting to change the way they pass from them usually using the outside of their foot to now the inside, applying this developed drive theory to this certain situation would mean that when arousal is high, instead of implementing what the coach wants them to, they would instead perform their dominant response, which would be a pass with the outside of their foot, as this would be the player's dominant response in terms of how they would usually perform a pass. This therefore shows the development on Hull's original drive theory, as this includes the fact that arousal can be boosted by the presence of others, as well as the fact that increased arousal will inflict a dominant response from a performer. This theory can therefore be applied to scenario 2 in the form of Rachel's performance and arousal levels. This is because, as Sarah has portrayed, and as you would commonly assume, anxiety and arousal levels of performers in bigger, more important games is likely to be high. Despite this, we can still see Rachel performs very well in these games, despite the high importance and great amount of pressure in these games. As previously mentioned, things such as pressure and importance can be key influential factors when talking about high levels of anxiety and arousal, which further adds to the fact that it is likely Rachel has high levels of arousal during these games. This therefore can be applied to drive theory, as this states that performance will increase with arousal. Therefore, if Rachel has high levels of arousal, this would allow her to perform well in these games, which as we can see she does do. By the scenario stating she receives many Player of the Match awards. This therefore shows us how this theory can be applied to scenario 2 in the form of Rachel, as we would assume due to the importance of the game and how Sarah is, that Rachel will also have high levels of arousal and anxiety in these games. However, we can see that Rachel performs well in these high arousal levels, which links back to this drive theory, as this believes that the higher a person's arousal is, the better their performance, which is reinforced by Rachel within scenario 2.